My next guest, returning guest, somehow he hasn't given up on us yet. Matt Taibbi is one of our most acute observers of the political scene. He is a contributing editor at Rolling Stone. He is a former winner of, I believe, the National Magazine Award, and he is the author of a number of books, the most recent of which is entitled Hate Incorporated, Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. I think I got that right too. So first of all, Matt, thanks for coming on the program.
No, thanks a lot for having me, Richard.
Secondly, how much did I mangle in your introduction? Anything?
No, that was all right. Yeah,
Wow.
You nailed it. Yeah.
All right, okay. Well, I thought, I do want to talk about your book, which we talked about while it was a work in progress, but obviously you're covering the campaign now, so I wanted to start there, if you don't mind, and you've been writing about it. And I have to start with the topic of Hillary Clinton's recent comments. And I have to preface this by saying, in language that complies with FCC regulations, that I effing hate that we have to have this conversation at this political moment to say that it is bad to call people with whom you disagree politically, whether they are Jill Stein, who I didn't vote for, or Tulsi Gabbard, much of whom I find disturbing. I find it a goddamn shame that we have to talk about whether it's okay to call people Russian assets without evidence in October 2019. But you've written about this. You may have a more measured take than I do.
Probably not. No, it's amazing that when Hillary Clinton comes out, and it was a very I would say cleverly released statement that she made in this podcast that she gave with former Obama aide David Plouffe. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Is it Plouffe?
I think it's Plouffe, but I'm not sure. I've met him, but I think it's Plouffe, but I'm not 100% sure.
There's sort of a rambling section of this interview where she says basically they're going to do third party again. They're grooming somebody who is currently a candidate in the Democratic primary race. She is a favorite of the Russians. And then she goes on to immediately talk about Jill Stein, and says Jill Stein, that's assuming Jill Stein gets out because she's also a Russian asset. She's totally a Russian asset. And the language, she obviously doesn't mention Tulsi Gabbard by name, but it's very clear that that's who she's talking about, the Hawaii congresswoman. And then, the Clinton campaign Hillary Clinton has since said that she was misquoted, that she wasn't referring to the Russians grooming Tulsi Gabbard. And if you read the transcript, it's really not entirely clear what she was talking about. She's saying they're going to do third party again. So who's they? Is she saying the Republicans were behind Jill Stein last time? It doesn't make sense either way. But the point is, when she said this notion that Tulsi Gabbard and Jill Stein and Donald Trump, that they're all Russian assets, which is another cleverly used word, because if you ask intelligence people,
right,
asset is a word, like I talked to one former CIA agent about this because I was confused, and I said, what does asset mean? And his response was, an asset is 100% someone that you control, right? It's a person who's on the ground. If it's not if you're using somebody and you don't control them, that's not intelligence. That's serendipity. That's the quote that I got. But you can play it in the media as asset is just somebody who is an unwitting accomplice of a foreign power, and that's what they've done. But it's a very slimy McCarthyist way of doing things, and it just took the media by storm last week. And fortunately, there were some Democrats who pushed back on it in the race, but I don't think enough. I don't know about what you think. It was just a disgraceful episode.
No, and those Democrats got viciously attacked. Just to be clear, so I'm clear, Number one, first of all, the way to pronounce David Plouffe is Uber executive who cashed in on his public service to make millions of dollars hurting the public. That's the proper pronunciation of his name. Number one. Number two, I would say I tried to look at this, Matt, but the most generous, when the correction or clarification came out or whatever, interpretation was that A, Tulsi Gabbard is beloved by the Russians and they will try to elevate her. B, perhaps she meant the Republicans would groom her as a third-party candidate, even though she has denied any intention to run as a third-party candidate. Three, Jill Stein, in Hillary Clinton's words, was unequivocally, quote unquote, a Russian asset for sure. And when she was asked if she was talking about Tulsi and the other references, she said, if the nesting doll fits. Cute.
Well, her spokesperson, Nick Merrill.
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. So, so here's why this disturbs me. So a lot of this is, capital E, capital O, extremely online. But so that's a small percentage of the population. But I feel somehow, first of all, I think it's appallingly McCarthyistic, as you've gathered, and I think you agree. Secondly, I think we now live in a political culture where people will defend, on the Democratic side, as well as Republican, where people will defend their heroes, whatever they say. I found it astonishing, but not, that there was a wave of people online defending Hillary Clinton for calling Tulsi Gabbard a Republican asset, and a Russian asset rather, and then reversed themselves when she said no, she meant the Republicans would run her. Well, then defending her for that. It was as if the content of the speech didn't matter. But lastly, and at some point we'll get to Hate Incorporated as part of this, I felt that this breezy, chipper, almost offhand accusation of a fellow Democrat, since Hillary's a Democrat and Tulsi's a Democrat, or in the case of Jill Stein, Hillary claims to be progressive, Jill Stein claims to be progressive. The idea that you wage a war of ideas with accusations of being in service of a foreign government, it should have gone out 50 years ago. And and ancillarily, if that's a word, that the regeneration of this notion that Jill Stein voters would have voted for Hillary Clinton, which has been disproven by exit polling, and therefore saved us from Donald Trump, I feel that that's just another narrative used to demonize the left. So ironically, the election of a right-wing president is being used to demonize the left, and this is all part of it.
Oh, this to me is 100%. Well, maybe not 100%, but primarily it's a way to discipline dissent within your own ranks. Because what ends up happening is that when somebody does something like this, and they've been doing this now for 3 years, this whole Russia thing, and anybody who disagrees with it, I mean, I get it more or less constantly. People like Glenn Greenwald get it constantly. You're a Russian asset if you don't go along with X, Y, or Z. What happens is people just don't want to deal with the fallout from it. So, I don't want to be called that. I don't want to have that be part of my reputation. So I'm not going to stand up for this person. So when you accuse Tulsi Gabbard or Jill Stein or Susan Sarandon or Glenn Greenwald or whoever it is of being, a Russian asset, what ends up happening is you get all these people who suddenly can't find anything to say, and they'll be quiet about it, and they'll jump on your side, all right, because they don't want to be the kid with lice. That's what happens. And in the online community, this kind of politics is so much more instantaneous and effective even than it was in McCarthy's day. And I think that's what they figured out. This is just an incredibly effective tool for disciplining people who have thoughts that are, not in the right place as far as they're concerned politically. And that's what's so gross about it.
Yeah, I think even a couple years ago, I think I called them the shock troops patrolling the barbed wire at the leftmost perimeter, and that's it. And I got to be honest with you, Matt Taibbi. There have been times when I've like held my fire a little bit because I don't want to be where you are. I don't want to be
Right.
where Glenn Greenwald is. I don't want to get this stuff all the time. And, I have spoken up about it a lot, but compared to what I might have said, I haven't always. And I'm not proud of that. But it's a lot of flack and it has implications, but it tells me that just as my father lived through McCarthyism and his career suffered as a result, and he had to sometimes live with that. Now good Democrats, quote unquote, are unashamed. And I'll tell you something else and then I'll stop, which is I've also seen in private conversations and email exchanges and so forth, people taking this as an opportunity to like trash Tulsi Gabbard. Now, I happen to really hate her relationship with Modi and a lot of other things. But it seems to me, number one, she is talking about, although I wouldn't use the rhetoric, necessarily the same rhetoric, she is talking more forcefully about war issues than anyone else out there. Although, Bernie's getting a lot better and has always been pretty good. But number two, if your first reaction to this kind of an attack on an American politician is to use it as an opportunity to recite a litany of what you don't like about that politician, I feel maybe you need to rethink your values just a little
Yeah.
bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a totally illegitimate way to respond to that. You're absolutely right. When this happened, I balked about it immediately. So did a lot of other people, and the responses you get are, "Oh yeah, but she likes Modi, she likes Assad, whatever." That's not the point. Forget
Right.
about what her political views are. You cannot, as an American, stand for somebody of the stature of Hillary Clinton questioning somebody's patriotism in public, calling them essentially a cutout for a foreign adversary, and using that as a way to try to influence the political scene. You want to debate Tulsi Gabbard's politics? Talk about that. You know, don't talk about her as some kind of nefarious Scooby-Doo villain who's palling around with Putin behind the scenes. I mean, it's an atrocious, disgusting form of politics, and I'm sorry that your father had to go through with that. I don't know what that story is, but I think we're going through something that's probably, it's different. Obviously, I think what happened in McCarthy's era, the consequences were just final for people, and it took them, ages to get over it if they ever did. But this is serious. It's not a joke what's going on right now with this stuff, and there are a lot of people. I know that Tulsi Gabbard, it's been a life-changing thing for her to be in the middle of this vortex. I think, and I think there are other people who are finding themselves in the same place.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I don't defend Tulsi Gabbard on the grounds of her military service. I defend her on the grounds that she has human rights.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess enough about that, except one last thing, and then I want to talk about the book, Matt
Sure.
Taibbi, which is what exactly do you suppose motivated Clinton to do this? I know the sort of mass think that provoked her followers to jump in and gang up, but what do you? I mean, was this calculated? Was this is just her spiel now? The Russians did me in, or I'd be. What do you think?
It's funny with the Clintons. You always have to wonder. They always think that they're playing eight-dimensional chess whenever they do anything. And so sometimes I think they just do stuff that's dumb, and then later they try to pass it off as some calculated, brilliant gambit. But you never know, because simultaneous to this entire episode, you saw these really remarkable stories in the Times, and I think the Washington Post also did one, that were floating the idea that major influential Democratic Party donors were frustrated with the field. Essentially, they were frustrated with the top three people in the race, Biden, Warren, and Sanders, for different reasons, and were floating the idea of recruiting some other person to jump in the race at the last minute, including Hillary Clinton. And her name has been mentioned a bunch of times, and there have been these sort of rumors in the ether Will she? Won't she? Now, some of this is just sort of idle gossip, and we heard the same kind of thing in the last race about Joe Biden. You might also remember Wes Clark, right? I mean, but there's something going on. I mean, people are talking about asking Kerry to come in, Devil Patrick, Eric Holder, Sherrod Brown, but definitely also Hillary Clinton. So is there something going on? Is this a trial balloon? I mean, you never know. You can't rule that out.
Somebody told me she added a policy page to her website yesterday, but I haven't had a chance to check that out.
Oh God.
Again, we're talking with Rolling Stone contributing editor Matt Taibbi, whose new book is entitled Hate Incorporated, Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise Each Other. Now, I want to ask you a lot about this. We talked about it while it was in progress. You said originally it was intended to be rethinking. I'm looking at your introduction of the new book, the new release, rethinking of the classic work by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, Manufacturing Consent. In fact, the original title was going to be Manufacturing Discontent. I suppose you could have also called it Manufacturing Content.
Right, or dissent, yeah,
Right. Because it's all about its content, right? Reading this, Matt, what I get the sense of is I'm trying to. The phrase that kept coming into mind was sort of analog version of digital conflict. In other words, that somehow we've come full circle, that digital media is now well known for its ability to agitate us and trigger us in order to amplify our engagement and get us addicted. And that while to a certain extent we in the media have always done that to a greater or lesser extent, that one of the takeaways for me is that's all it is now. It's not all it is. There are a lot of good people working in the industry, but it's a primary driving force is get people agitated, get people, because then you get them engaged, and you get the eyeballs, and you get the, whatever you need for profitability. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think what this book is mainly about, and I did start it off as trying to rethink manufacturing consent, but it's really more of from a reporter I view in all this. I think the basic idea is sort of what you're talking about, but the big change is 30 years ago, 40 years ago, commercial news companies were trying to get the whole audience. There were 3 big networks, there were a couple of big newspaper chains, and they were using a dispassionate, detached, kind of boring third-person delivery that was designed to be consumed by the entire family, for instance, around the TV, in the 80s. So whatever your political slant was, you could all sit down and watch Walter Cronkite together. That's changed now with the advent of the internet and cable. Instead of trying to get the whole audience, everybody's doing what Fox is doing, and they're essentially trying to dominate a whole or a part of a demographic by just giving it political slant that is sort of pre-selected to fit that audience's political orientation. So everybody in the business knows on some level that this is what we're doing. We're picking out news and themes and ideas that we know that our demographic is going to agree with, and we just don't challenge our audiences anymore. And that's what this book is really about. We're winding people up just long enough so that they can see an ad, and that's really what the business is now. And I'm trying to create consumer awareness about that.
And see, it seems to me, consumer awareness is a great phrase, by the way. It seems to me that that's exactly what there's just such a solid through line from the Hillary Clinton remarks to that.
Totally.
Right? Because she's playing the media landscape. The media is feeding her, and within it all, there's this sense of the truth becomes, it's not even a casualty anymore. It never even comes into being. It feels like, yeah, it's irrelevant. Thank you. Because it's not, it's a post-truth world. I mean, it doesn't matter the Mueller report didn't say any politicians were Russian assets. It doesn't matter that Hillary Clinton provided no evidence that of Russian connection. I mean, I guess Jill Stein had dinner with Putin, but I would venture to say that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, probably had lunch or dinner with him too. So,
Hillary's husband had met with Vladimir Putin before he took $500,000 in a speech for in front of Renaissance Capital. So I mean,
right, Rosprom or whatever that Russian bank is, right? That's literally $500,000 in Russian money. So the sort of emerging of met with the Russians, which might mean somebody with an ICH on their last, it just, so we have this post-truth universe, but I know this is going to be an issue. I know reviewers of your book, at least one has mentioned it. So I have to bring this up.
Sure.
I feel compelled to bring this up. The cover, okay? The cover shows Sean Hannity on the left, and in red, Rachel Maddow on the right, in blue, Hate Incorporated, Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. To use the time-worn by now social media phrase, is that false equivalence?
Well, I'm definitely trolling people a little bit with that because I think it's a little counterintuitive for people who watch that channel. But what I'm saying, if you read the book, is that forget about what the content is of those networks. The commercial strategy of MSNBC and Fox are identical, and they're using exactly the same techniques to make money. And the idea, what's common between both Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow, and they have a lot more in common now than they did 3 years ago. But the first thing that they have in common is that you're not getting any kind of dispositive or negative information about your own side, right? So if you watch Hannity, you're not going to get negative stuff about Republicans or Donald Trump or whatever it is. It's just full blast anti-liberals, anti-Democrats, whatever, down the line. But that's exactly what MSNBC is. You're just not going to get any kind of other counterbalancing information on that network at all now. And they used to justify that by saying, well, at least truth has a liberal bias, but that wasn't true in the last 3 years. I mean, she relentlessly flogged this Russiagate story, which was a completely phony, bogus story, and showed absolutely no interest in doing the normal journalistic work of checking any of the assumptions in that story. And what a coincidence. It was a hugely profitable enterprise. They surged to the top of the ratings in primetime, cable primetime ratings for the first time since the late 90s. And that was the first time anybody had displaced Fox. So they're essentially doing the same thing. They're just throwing stuff at their demographics that they know are going to wind up their audiences. And yes, I know people who will say, yes, but Sean Hannity's so much worse. He's a white supremacist. He's a racist. Fine. Yeah, this is not a morality contest. This is about the business model. Forget what you're hearing. Think about the how of what's going on. Think about what's actually going on financially when you turn on these channels, and there's really not much difference.
And again, we're talking with Matt Taibbi, author of the new book, Hate Incorporated. I think there are multiple, obviously, journalism has always been a business, right? I mean, we know that. Mm-hmm. But I think both know, we also both know, that it did come with an ethic, a value system, maybe not in the front office or whatever, but among editors and journalists, a kind of devotion. You and I have talked about this before, a kind of devotion to truth as a fundamental value. It's like, don't say stuff that you don't know is true. Or don't say stuff that you don't think you have a pretty good indication is true. Particularly, the more extravagant the claim, the more obligation to figure out if it might be true. So to say, for example, that that major politicians are foreign assets, or says such and such a tape exists, or whatever it might be, I've got to say that partisan politics aside, well, first of all, I haven't watched Maddow in years, so I can't really speak to her anymore. But literally, I haven't. I just had to stop. But I don't know how people call themselves journalists and live with themselves if they have no disregard for the truth. I think it's fair to say that if I get something wrong in print, I'm clinically depressed for at least 3 days. It's
Well,
only,
yeah, no.
you know, so
No. And sorry to interrupt. It's such an
sure.
important point. And I was raised that way. My father, who was in the business, was raised that way. And we can get to the reasons. I think there are important financial reasons why they had that ethos before. But that was the old school. That was the first principle of being a journalist once upon a time, is that you were just terrified of getting it wrong. It didn't matter what the story meant. Like, if it used to be, and this still happens with me. Every time I do a feature, even though you might fact check it to death, you just never know if there's something in there that might just go sideways on you when you publish it, and you hold your breath until it's out there, until everyone's seen it and the entire world has looked it over, and a week passes and you didn't get anything wrong. If you get anything wrong, you're absolutely right. It's depression time. It's terror time for a journalist, right? That's the entire job, is just being terrified of being wrong, right? And you have to think about that the entire time. And that's what drives me crazy about this new landscape. Like, if you look back at I hate to focus on Rachel, but this is the example. Like, when the Steele report came out, and that was this huge story all across the landscape. Oh, the P tape. Oh, a sex tape. Putin's got a sex tape on Donald Trump. Like, that's the kind of story that would just trigger my terror mechanism as a journalist, like 1,000%, because it's based on essentially one unverifiable source, and it's an explosive, outlandish claim, right? That if you get wrong, you're the biggest jerk in the world. So as a reporter, everybody should have been totally at arm's length about that story, but instead they piled onto it and they gave you all these reasons why you should believe it. Like, look, they've done sex tapes in the past, Putin has, and the KGB used to blackmail people, so why not believe it? Like, that was what those broadcasts were about. And so, I'm sorry, that's just an important point, and that you're absolutely right. That's what a normal journalist thinks. Like, I'm going to be so depressed if I'm wrong, and they don't think that way anymore, and that drives me crazy.
And you know what I was thinking as you were talking about was that the readership culture has changed too, in the sense that Walter Cronkite was not perfect, but nobody's perfect. But if Walter Cronkite's audience, or Edward R. Murrow's audience, or David Brinkley's audience heard that he published a outlandish story that changed the narrative without evidence, and it turned out to be not true, the audience, their career would have been over. They'd have no more credibility. But you have a Rachel Maddow or a Sean Hannity who can do that with no consequence. So, we Democrats talk about Trump has no accountability for the illegal things he does. Well, journalists, I think we need accountability too. I think.
Sure.
Most of what I've ever written, majority of it would be considered opinion journalism. I mean, I can't say, I love your line when you say about yourself, I was the triumph, the insult, comic dog of journalism. Well, I agree. But even in the most sort of overheated opinion stuff that I've ever written, I never wanted to get a single tiny fact wrong, and I'm nothing special. I'm just like, that's what the job used to be. I'm sorry to rant, but
what you're saying is so key, and it's such an important part of what I'm trying to say in this book. We all thought that way. That was a common denominator to working anywhere in the news business, is that the one thing, it was like this sword of Damocles hanging over your head. Like, you just couldn't screw up. Like, you couldn't get a big thing wrong, and that if you did, you were done. It's not like you had a second act in this job. If you really, really screwed something up factually, look what happened to Dan Rather. He fell for one thing, and that happens. Like, people try to sell you wolf whistles all the time in this business.
Right.
And you make a mistake, and he was essentially, cashiered out of big media for that. And we all understood that would be the normal consequence of this in this job. And you're right, that's not the dynamic anymore. Now you make a mistake, you kind of move on, because that's not the relationship with audiences anymore. They don't really typically expect you to be right all the time. They expect you to be on your side all the time.
And is there anything that can be done about that, Matt? I mean, I'm always like, oh, okay, what can we do? Like Mr. Sincerity or something. But what the hell? I mean, it's like, I don't know exactly how to get out of it. I mean, obviously the news business is struggling for money. People are getting laid off all the time. It's
Well, I don't
hard.
think that's an accident, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're probably right.
Yeah.
You know what? You are right, if I may say so, because, like you say, there wasn't as great demand in the business for takedown artists, provided you're taking down the right people. Well, you don't have to research a story to take somebody down, do you? You don't have to have a metropolitan staff to write something insulting about the mayor. You just can sit down and write something insulting about the mayor. You don't have to do an expose. It doesn't take research, doesn't take time. I saw Julie K. Brown, who's a great reporter, honored the other night for her work bringing down Jeffrey Epstein. But how many people aren't being brought down because there's so few people out there with a career gig who can take the time to do the research to take down a Jeffrey Epstein?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They don't give investigative reporters the time domestically to work on things. Everybody is under constant pressure to crank out content, and because you're absolutely right, you can make just as much money and get just as many clicks just writing something snotty about somebody that doesn't take any research at all. Why spend a week and 100 phone calls working on a story when you can get just as much traffic doing something that takes no thought at all? When I was coming up in the business, every major network and newspaper, they had bureaus in every big country in the world, like real big newsrooms. If you went to Moscow or Berlin or Rome or any of those, but you walked in, they had huge offices that were dedicated to understanding the world and getting it right. Now they don't even bother. Nobody has that anymore. There's a couple of wire services around there. Why do the work, right? If you don't need to make the money. But the problem is that what the businesses don't understand is that what people were buying when they gave their attention back in the day and the advertisers invested in those audiences, what they were buying was the confidence that these people were telling them the truth. And if they stop having that confidence, they're not going to come in the numbers aren't going to be as big. And that's why they're drifting to shows like yours, to Joe Rogan, to Jimmy Dore. I mean, it's going to be independent people who they see and understand are human beings and can connect with on that level, because they're not going to trust the institutional news networks anymore.
Well, it's hard to know what the future is going to be like. So but I think you have a point. I hope more of them come to this show. Joe's got enough, but and your podcast as well with Katie Halper. But before we go, what kind of reactions have you gotten from other people in the news business?
It's interesting. Obviously, there are a lot of people who just blanch at the cover, right? Because they just can't get past the idea that MSNBC is as bad as Fox, so their brains don't work beyond that. But I hear from a lot of reporters, and I've been hearing from people for years now, that their frustration at the increasingly binary structure of the media, and it's now with this impeachment story, it's not even, there's not even a disguise on it anymore. You're on one team or you're on the other team. That's it, and a lot of us got into this business because we didn't want to take sides in politics, and journalism was a good way to kind of stay out of it in a lot of ways, because you're just sort of giving people the facts and here, you deal with it.
Right.
Now the business is no longer like that. So it's gotten a mixed reaction. I think a lot of audiences I hear from a lot of readers who like it because they're very frustrated at the way the news makes them feel now. They don't like being manipulated and made angry over nothing, and I think that's what the consumer experience is like for a lot of people. And then from reporters, it's a mixed bag, but I think I do hear from a lot of people who are like, yeah, we got to do something about this. This has gotten crazy. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Democracy dies in darkness, but mushrooms do quite well. So, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Matt
Sure.
Taibbi, contributing editor of Rolling Stone and author of the new book Hate Incorporated: Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. Thanks for writing it. Thanks for your great reporting, and thanks for coming on the program.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Richard. Take care.
You too.